the Deputy Envoy under George Mitchell, and most recently Assistant Administrator, is that the term, for USAID dealing with the whole of the Middle East, and of course particularly within your job description was dealing with the West Bank and Gaza. Mara is also the founder and director of QUORUM Strategies, which is an international consulting agency. The way we're going to do this is each of the speakers will speak for 10 to 15 minutes. I might ask a question or two, and then we'll open it to the audience. I'm really looking forward to this. And maybe we should start with you, Bob.
Great, thank you. Thanks all for coming. There are about 1.8 million people that live there, so the population density, actually only known by kilometers, is about 4,660 people per square kilometer, which is shocking density. So second only, it'd be less dense than Hong Kong or Singapore, but more dense than virtually everywhere else. Demographic growth is almost 3.5% per year. So population is doubling every 18 years. For UNRWA, for those unfamiliar, there's a couple of things that make us unique in the family of UN agencies. One is the caseload. We only have a specific mandated caseload, which is Palestine refugees who were displaced in 1946 and 1948, lost their livelihoods and their property. We only work in 5 fields of operation: Gaza, West Bank, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. That's the limit of our mandate. That's what the General Assembly told us to do. And we are different in our service delivery. We are the only UN agency that directly implements its own programs. So, for example, the World Food Program does not distribute food. They move food and they subcontract the distribution to someone else. UNICEF does not manage schools. They support national institutions in education development. We do everything ourselves. So we have 30,000 staff in those 5 fields of operation. The operation I manage in Gaza, we have 13,000 staff. We have, it's easiest to conceive of us as having 4 parallel ministries: education, healthcare, relief, and public works. So our education program, I'm Canadian, our education program would be second largest in Canada, second only to Toronto, and we'll pass them probably within the next 3 or 4 years. So we have 231,000 children in 245 schools that we manage. We have more than 9,000 teachers on our payroll in Gaza. We have a healthcare system with 21 primary health clinics. We have 4.5 million patient visits per year in our health clinics. We have a relief program that is distributing food to more than 800,000 people, which is almost half of the entire population, and 2 out of every 3 refugees. And we have a public works department with an enormous construction portfolio of about $200 million of sort of ongoing construction projects. We're the second largest employer in Gaza. In 2012, we represented between 16 and 18% of the GDP, likely higher last year, but I haven't seen the figures yet. More than 70% of the population of Gaza, so 1.3 out of 1.8 million people, are refugees. So they're looking to us for service as opposed to the Palestinian Authority. So the role that we play there, economically, culturally, socially, is very, very significant. It's a huge part of what it means to be in Gaza. And we've been the one stabilizing force. We've been the one stable force through the Egyptians, the Israelis, through the PA, through Hamas. There's always been UNRWA. So it's a huge operation, particularly relative to the size of the place. The humanitarian situation, I'll break it into 3 sort of components. Some of you will be familiar with the Gaza 2020 report, which was put out by the UN country team in 2012. That highlights some of the longer-term challenges that Gaza is facing, particularly related to water, power, and demographics. The demographics, as I mentioned, is 3.5% population growth, so just keeping up to that population growth in the provision of basic services, in shelter, is a huge challenge for all providers. Bigger challenges are in power and water, water particularly. The water in Gaza is extracted from the coastal aquifer, which is being dramatically over-extracted. I think the numbers are 160 million cubic meters per year being extracted, and regeneration at about 60 million cubic meters per year. May have the numbers slightly off. but it gives you an idea of the problem. So the aquifer is dying. It's being inundated by the Mediterranean. For example, the apartment building that I live in Gaza, you can't drink the water. Obviously, more than 90% of the water in Gaza is not potable, but you can't brush your teeth with it. You shower with it, you can taste the salt on your lips when you're done. It's simply not particularly usable, and the situation is getting worse. The United Nations Environment Program has said that the aquifer will be irreversibly damaged and unusable by 2020. The power situation, there's 3 sources of power. Some has purchased about 22 megawatts from Egypt, about 120 megawatts from Israel, and the local power generation has capacity, has 4 turbines. Normally they try to operate 2, and it produces between 55 and 60 megawatts. That's enough power to have power on for 8 hours and off for 8 hours at a time on a general daily average. The power plant was down for 3 months at the end of last year, so power was off between 12 and 16 hours at a time. And this is a problem that can be resolved by more power, but there are lots of political ramifications and a lot of political decisions that need to be made before that can happen. But those are serious. I mean, the water problem is an existential threat to Gaza as a livable place within the next few years. We're not talking decades down the road, we're talking years down the road. That's the longer term need. The medium term, we would talk about as a result of the blockade that was imposed by Israel in 2007, that dramatically restricts partially what comes in, but more importantly, what comes out. The problems with Gaza are not structural in nature. There's nothing wrong with Gaza. There's nothing wrong with Gazans. It's probably the most educated workforce I've worked with anywhere, including in Canada. I'm surrounded by more PhDs and master's degrees now where I work than I did anywhere else. The Gazan people have a tremendous capacity for change. They're very entrepreneurial. They will seize any opportunity, but there simply aren't. As I said, it's not so much that stuff can't in, it's that stuff can't go out. So there's no access to markets. They can't. Anything they produce can only be sold in Gaza. So unemployment rate is 41%, which probably underrepresents unemployment, and that's not going to significantly improve. That frankly is why we have such a huge food assistance program, is to try to mitigate some of the worst effects of the unemployment that's created by the blockade. The more immediate problems, the more immediate challenges were created by the changes in the government and policies in Egypt. Since last June, the Egyptian authorities have closed the tunnels that existed between Gaza and Egypt. Now, I am not advocating for the tunnels to be reopened. However, the tunnel trade formed a necessary lifeline between Gaza and Egypt, allowed them access to goods that they could not get elsewhere, and it provided goods that were cheaper. So it had 2 big impacts. One was on prices, particularly fuel, because fuel is subsidized in Egypt, and so the price of fuel more than doubled virtually overnight. And then other basic goods that are just cheaper in Egypt, basic foodstuffs, for example, clothing. And then more important was construction material for the private sector. The Israelis do not allow construction material to come in for the private sector. They do for us under very, very stringent conditions, which we can talk more about, but I won't be able to fit it all within 15 minutes. So somebody needs to ask a question about that. So the private sector was the one, construction was the one component of the economy that had been creating jobs in the private sector. All of that material came through the tunnels. And when we talk about the tunnels, it's not a couple of guys sort of crawling through on their hands and knees. This was industrial import that happened to be taking place underground. So there was 1 million liters of fuel per day coming through the tunnels. There was 7,500 metric tons of construction material per day coming through the tunnels. This was a border. It was regulated on both the Egyptian side and the Gazan side, and it fed the private sector. So those jobs in the construction sector were lost, and the jobs that actually worked on the tunnel trade were lost. And again, that's not advocating for the tunnels to come back, it's just stating a reality, an economic reality. So the impact of that was a huge spike in unemployment. And not only were the tunnels closed, but the border crossing with Egypt has been closed almost all the time for the last about 10 months, 9 months. Very few Gazans are allowed to travel out through Israel. Very few can get permits, including amongst our staff. And so Rafah crossing with Egypt was the only way that people could get in and out. And that's, as I say, has been mostly closed for the last 9 months. That's had a huge psychological impact on the population. And those that know the place well, that had been out for a while and have come back recently, have been shocked at the change amongst the population, even amongst our staff, who are amongst the most relatively privileged within Gaza. They get a regular paycheck, for example, which virtually nobody else can count on. So it's seen really a rapid deterioration over the last 9-10 months. It was probably at its worst in November, December of last year. It has improved slightly since then, partially because the power plant, which had been down for 3 months, was able to restart. And then we get to today, and there's nothing structurally wrong with Gaza. Everything there, the problems there are driven by policy. So the current discussions about changing in the political environment, the possibility of a technocratic government, possibility, I think, down the road of reconciliation between Fatah and Hamas, that can have a positive impact. I think the one expectation that people have now that will be very disappointed if it doesn't happen would be they would hope that Rafah will be open on a regular basis so that people can get in and out. But it doesn't, it's not likely to have significant impact on the economic situation and therefore the humanitarian situation. Because what people need is opportunity. They need the ability to be employed. That's really what they want. And there's no sense that, at least in the initial phases, that if a technocratic government is named, it's going to have any significant on the policies that are not allowing people to work. And so we continue to try to meet the need as it exists. We continue to offer our basic services in healthcare and in education. We continue to try to meet the humanitarian need, the direct humanitarian need that's created by the conditions. Our ability to do that has been weakened because of the shortfalls or reductions in the amount of funding that we receive for our humanitarian operations, not from the U.S. government, I have to say. The U.S. government continues to be our largest contributor, and we get great support both financially and politically from the U.S. government. But other donors have been less forthcoming, and so we're in a situation where it's uncertain that we'll be able to continue our food assistance program, at least at the scale that it's on today. So lots of challenges. As we said at the outset, it's always an interesting time. It's particularly interesting now, and it'll be particularly interesting for the coming weeks. But there's no changes, there's no foreseeable changes in the political environment that's likely to have much positive impact on the longer-term requirements or the shorter-term needs.
Thank you. A lot of questions, a lot of things to think about. But before we get to that, Mara.
Thanks, Rudman, and thanks for holding this forum here today. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to be here with Bob. I didn't expect to agree with everything that was said. I think it's a good opportunity to have a discussion that way with the two of us here who are going to come from different perspectives and also, I think, have some shared experiences as well. I appreciate the fact that Bob kind of set the table, so to speak, in laying out a lot of the facts and the very, very difficult situation that it presents for, that Gaza presents for anyone who is living there. And I agree also that it is a particularly difficult time to live in Gaza, though I also don't know, and we were talking about it just right, excuse us, but as you were doing the introduction, about whether there's ever been an easy time to live in Gaza. I first visited there in 1987, which Bob tells me may have been Gaza's heyday, the end of the heyday, if there is such a thing, for living in Gaza, that perhaps the best period of life there, maybe is what you hear from people who were there, was, ironically or not, from 1967 to 1987, or that general period. I will say that I drove in to Gaza at that time. I don't recall, though I'm getting old enough to not necessarily have a crystal clear memory of it, but I don't recall driving through a checkpoint. I drove with an Israeli lawyer into Gaza, and everything looked very different. I certainly have not spent, I've never lived on the ground in Gaza. I haven't spent the amount of intense time, I'm sure I haven't covered the range of area there that Bob has in the intense period he's been there since 2012. But I have been back and forth periodically in the time since 1987, so I have that period of time to witness and see the changes. And so I say from that perspective, and certainly having kept in touch with a number of friends who do live there, that it is not and has never been, in my experience, an easy place to live, and a place where the trajectory for far too long has not been a good one. And so part of how I'd like to approach this discussion is to talk about, to answer one of the questions, or just to have us, I hope as a group, discuss one of the key questions that was laid out in your invitation, which is what can be done to improve the humanitarian and economic forecast for Palestinians in Gaza. In other words, what can we do as an international community to try to change what is and has been for far too long a grim trajectory. And in doing that, I want to start at what may seem like a place of a ridiculous amount of detail. But for me, sometimes in the detail comes some of the beginning of the answers to the bigger questions. So last week, going in, I wanted to look and see, I haven't worked on these details closely for about a year now. So I wanted to see what went in to Gaza from Kerem Shalom, which is the main commercial crossing point. And though I take Bob's point that what is very, very important are goods coming out of Gaza, it's actually also pretty important if you live in Gaza to make sure you're getting goods coming in and you have goods to work with. And again, because I think I had some of the benefit of time, in 2008, and I went back to my records, and I have the records to show that in 2008 it was actually a real problem for goods coming into Gaza as well. So it's important, even though we have far from a perfect situation now, to recognize also times when things were worse. And so the fact that last week from Kerem Shalom, the crossing going into Gaza, there were about 1,800 truckloads of goods for commercial purposes coming into Gaza. And there were another nearly 400 scheduled trucks that didn't get there for one reason or another. But I want to focus, of those 2,000, nearly 2,000, 1,800 trucks, let's say, for commercial purposes, about 214 carried construction goods. I also want to focus on that because construction goods are terribly important for a range of reasons. Now, it's very likely, I'm guessing, I haven't asked Bob or others involved, though I did see a separate notice that there were 26 UNRWA projects or UN projects approved in the last couple of weeks. So I'm guessing that a number of those construction goods were actually for international projects. A lot of them may have been for UN projects. So that doesn't surprise me, because in fact, what I recall is that the construction goods that are allowed in are those that are allowed for international projects. There were some pilot projects at a couple points in the last year that were being tested of allowing very, very limited amount of construction goods for private sector projects. Those were pilots. That's one of the places I think would be interesting to press going forward. But I also don't think that it should be negated that you can get in construction goods, and it's a challenge for international projects. Bob, I know you got there in 2012, so you didn't live through the time from 2010 to 2012 of negotiating to get to the point of getting these truckloads in and having it run in what is a far more routine way, though I'm sure there's a lot of work and a lot of challenges getting there, but a far more routine way than occurred before. And I just want to focus it for each of those truckloads that comes in, the number of ancillary jobs that accompanies those, because it's not just the construction work involved, it's the vendors that sell to the groups, it's the contractors that are involved in building, and it's also filling very real needs, as you pointed out. It's schools that are built. I know that just in, I believe it was 2011, and I think there are people from the US government here who could correct me if I'm wrong, but in 2011 or 2012, there were 10 or 15 UNRWA schools that were specifically built with US funding. And that was part of the push to work very closely with Robert Seri and with Filippo Grande of UNRWA at that point to make sure that, again, there was that attention to detail, that rules were changed so that major truckloads were coming in. So it's not just to ensure that the international projects get built, which is important because they're filling important needs. It's to make sure that the goods get in and that there are ancillary jobs related to it. You end up, I think even now, as you pointed out, with far more pressure on UNRWA, and by the way, far more pressure on the Palestinian Authority as well, because you now are the two that are sources of employment in Gaza. Because the PA, I think as a lot of folks know, is paying a lot of the salaries in Gaza. And as Hamas, since the tunnels closed, have cut their salary payments in half, the sources of employers in Gaza that means the burden has become that much heavier on UNRWA, as Bob pointed out, and also on the PA in terms of funding. So it means that these construction projects and the international construction projects become that much more important. And so, again, they're a source of a lot of things, and I point them out just because it was something that international work, working with the coordinator of government affairs in the territories, which is the Israeli point for how those goods come into Gaza, is what brought about getting to that kind of number of truckloads coming in on a weekly basis. And Bob may well tell us that was a very high weekly number that, again, I just happened to pull up from last week because that was the week these projects were approved. And I will point out that only one truckload exited last week, which again points to the problem that he noted that has been a long-standing problem with getting goods out of Gaza is much harder, and getting goods in isn't near where it needs to be, but much better than it had been at some point a few years before. The reason unemployment has continued to go up, despite this particularly spiked, when I talked to a good friend who's a wire reporter in Gaza, he used numbers, I think he said 41%. His numbers were higher, maybe in formal rate. But he said it had doubled, basically, unemployment from 26%, he used the figure for 2012, to 48% is what he said now, based on the tunnel economy. But so that's some construction goods. I think then you can't really, though, build buildings and have the construction needs fulfilled without also dealing with electricity and dealing with water needs. And those are underlying challenges that are not even being met anywhere close to met for current population needs, for current building needs, let alone for future needs. And that also relates to population explosion concerns as well, which need to be addressed in a policy context as well as a political context. There had been a fair amount of work done very quietly on the water issues, and some very basic infrastructure work that had been done by AID between, I may have my years off a little bit, but I think from basically 2011 onwards to start doing some of the I'm going to use the word infrastructure, but infrastructure work in local communities at a fairly basic level. That work did go forward, again, where and as it was possible. I'm not saying that's not work at the margins, but it's work that was not possible before, that was made possible through some decisions by Secretary of State Clinton and through work by the Israelis with the Gaza Water Authority as well. And then there was a lot of discussion and some forward planning by the Norwegians, the Palestinian Water Authority, and the Gaza Water Authority that I think probably has been stymied for a variety of reasons that we can ascribe to politics or to challenges with policy decision-making or a variety of different things, but they go to the medium-term and longer-term needs of dealing with Gaza's water supply situation and how to work on desalination facilities. But there are, I mention this because there are solutions that people have in mind that are possible that need to also be worked at the same time that you work the electricity situation. Bob made reference to some of the complications of the electricity situation. I will say that the politics involved are not just the politics you might think. In other words, they're not just politics between Israelis and Palestinians. They are intra-Palestinian politics. They are West Bank Gaza politics. They are some politics with the Egyptians. They are private sector, public sector politics. Among the reasons, just to give you one anecdote, that the price doubles or the price increases so tremendously on fuel when fuel stopped being smuggled in from Egypt and ended up instead coming otherwise into Gaza, is you have the price of fuel coming in through Kerem Shalom, through the crossing, is higher because Israeli fuel, not smuggled, is more expensive. But then you also have an added tax that comes when it's coming from the PA as well. And so there are a variety of different arrangements, and obviously to have a solution on something like desalination for water, you have to have a way to work on your electricity needs. Now all of this may sound very far from anything that has to do with negotiations and Fatah-Hamas reconciliation, and it's often why I think our folks who like to write about negotiations and like to talk about negotiations don't ever talk about things like water and electricity, and don't necessarily spend a lot of time on humanitarian issues other than perhaps to think about who writes the check for it. But in truth, and certainly in practice, and almost definitely if you're living in Gaza, and frankly if you're living in a lot of places in the West Bank, these are the things that at the end of the day matter to you as much as whether any solution is negotiated between the guys, and they're almost always guys, let's be honest, who are meeting in a room somewhere. And so part of where I think the solution lies in both fronts or in both tracks, as is often a popular way of putting it, is to look at where the common interests are for all the parties involved. And the truth is, this is where you get back to water and electricity. Because the guys negotiating in those rooms, it may not be those exact people, but their national interests of their leaders are very much centered on things, on the same issues in terms of water, electricity. They go to sustainability of resources and the security of their people. And ultimately, and it's all about how you frame those interests for them. So if we don't, together, as an international community, find a way to resolve the water scarcity issues in Gaza, if we don't find a way to resolve the electricity and power issues in Gaza, and also share and work out the sustainability and sharing of those resources in Gaza and the West Bank, anyone who thinks that that's not going to impact Israel very directly is not thinking through this very carefully. Anyone who thinks that's not going to have an impact in the Sinai, and ultimately for Egypt, is not thinking through this very carefully. Those are going to go very immediately and very quickly to security issues for Israel. It's not a coincidence that this was one of the most regular topics of conversation I had with the coordinator for government affairs in the territories, who was a 3-star, 2-star Israeli general. 3 stars as high as they go. Most of them are 2. And So a very high-ranking Israeli military officer who spent a considerable amount of his time and resources and his staff time and resources on the issue of power and electricity for Gaza. It's a little harder sometimes to have that same time and attention spent by some of the I'll leave it out, by others. But there's a way of framing the issue to highlight the importance and to show across the board its importance. And I would say when we're talking about things like desalinization and the expertise involved, you have tremendous expertise in Israel on it. You have tremendous expertise among Qataris and Emiratis as well. And you have deep pockets, which as a former USAID person, I would always be looking for where you have funding resources, not just in the US government, but in other governments as well, to help for funding and finding solutions for these things. And you would have interest in resolving it. On the US side, as Bob pointed out, the United States is the largest bilateral donor to UNRWA. Congress has, and you always have to work in the executive branch to find congressional willingness to help on these things. Congress has supported Gaza as well as the West Bank in terms of funding, but has been more reticent in the past to give funding to Gaza that is not USAID funding for Gaza that is not specifically for humanitarian purposes. So UNRWA is seen as generally humanitarian in nature, and US funding for UNRWA is separate than USAID funding, just for people to keep that. So USAID funding is between $370 million and $400 million a year. I'm not there right now, so I don't know the exact figures. But of that $370 to $400 million, 15 million, 1/5, is roughly the cut that goes to Gaza. So why do I know that? Because actually, Capitol Hill asks AID to take a slice of the overall money and ask how much of it goes to Gaza. And they want to know that it's humanitarian specific money. So, the other thing we need to do is put the water and electricity solutions into that context and describe why those are humanitarian needs to be able to convince people on the importance of funding. So why don't I leave things there, but just to give you a sense of how I would approach finding solutions.
Thank you, Mara, actually for focusing on the opportunities side of the panel, not only the challenges. Just one, if I may, challenge to what you said. The Access and Movement Agreement, the AMA, the one that regulated Rafah and Karem Shalom, was negotiated by Condi Rice on the Palestinian side. We had Nasreen Haj Ahmed, who was the lead negotiator, so it's not only guys. Sometimes we have women involved in this. Okay, I'm going to ask a couple of questions. Maybe I'm going to start with you, Bob, and I'm going to shift the focus a little bit from policy and politics, and actually ask you an impressionistic question. One about the atmospherics. One of my biggest, when I first went to Gaza in '98, my biggest surprise, actually, you know, before you go to Gaza, you hear that this is a backwater full of bearded people with AKs, and you know, the image is not very positive. The image is always very grim. Yet my experience of Gaza was always having a very vibrant community there, socially, in terms of the economic opportunities, seeking opportunities, politically vibrant. So I wonder, now, I mean, today, after those many years of additional hardship, what is the general atmosphere as you see it? What is the general mood? How hopeful or how lacking of hope, and how is that affecting the trends that we see within Gaza now?
I liked your duration of engagement, so I don't have the view over 10 or 20 years, but just within the last two, really very noticeable, significant deterioration in the psychological environment. Both, I mean, the economics, I think it was clear we can do that statistically, but what you can't see, I mean, you can't measure, has been the deterioration in people's, their psyche, the desperation, the frustration, the lack of hope. I think when we came out of the November 2012 conflict or escalation, or whatever term we want to use, there was very much a sense of optimism that things really were going to improve, that there would be, Israel would get enhanced security and the blockade would be eased and that people would be given an opportunity to work, which is really what they want. I mean, independent of, Secretary Kerry was wildly successful in we get a Palestinian state with defined borders and everything else, we do all the status agreements. If the people in Gaza still can't access markets, it's really not going to matter much. They need freedom of movement for people and goods. That's what they need. Very much that optimism that existed a year and a half ago had dissipated by this time last year. And then with the closure of the tunnels, it was a huge amount of internal pressure that built up. It probably was worse in November, December of last year. I think it's improved a bit since then. But really just people just giving up. I mean, there was nothing that anybody could point to that had any even remote sense of optimism. That they could point to something and say, well, that looks like it's going to get better. There was nothing. And the Gazan people, this is, before I went there, of course, I was reading the same reports everybody else reads. I think it's unfortunate that Gaza generally never gets any press if a rocket is fired. The vast majority of Gazan people are just trying to survive and take care of their families the same as anybody anywhere else. The sacrifices that they'll make to continue to educate their children. I mean, we're at a position now where there's actually a negative return on the investment in education in Gaza. The more educated you are, the more likely you're unemployed, particularly amongst women. And culturally, the Palestinians in Gaza particularly take education so dramatically seriously. Families will sacrifice everything to educate their children. The fact that there's no gender discrimination in education, I mean, it's not, this isn't not the Taliban. Right. Yeah? Female participation in university is more than 50%. Right? There are more women in university than there are men in Gaza. This is not some theocracy. It's conservative. It's always been conservative. It's always been more conservative than the West Bank. It's certainly become more conservative since in the last decade. In my experience, in countries that have had huge shock, they tend to become more conservative, but I think that's also obviously been impacted by Hamas being in control there. And there's not, I mean, with Hamas being in control, it's not like there's a lot of political or social space for people. So a lot of pressures from a lot of different sides. And as I say, right now I think people, when they're looking at what's going to get better, how's my life going to get better, as far as they're willing to look is that Rafah opens. And they can physically get out if they need to. But beyond that, I don't see anybody with any broader kind of aspirations.
Thank you. And Mara, if I may point totally different direction as well. To your experience when you're working on facilitating access, and in particular, I mean, are there any lessons learned from that experience that we can apply today, or has that approach, working things on the ground, hit a ceiling until we get a better political environment? In particular, I'm really interested by your description of the various interests that come into play, governmental, non-governmental, private sector, etc. Is there any space there for creating a dynamic right now that can push some of these issues? And I agree with you, that peace will happen when peace will happen, but there are realities on the ground that we need to be pushed right now. Do you see a space for that at the current environment? And what lessons would you kind of recommend for that?
Well, I would describe it as not only a space but a responsibility to be pushing those interests. The reason I say it's a responsibility is because of the interests involved, because you still have, for example, as a U.S. citizen, you have United States money involved in our goods going back and forth, or indirectly through our assistance to UNRWA, our goods, I mean our assistance to USAID, and through USAID, and USAID still has programs in Gaza, for example. And we also play a role in helping other international actors as well with the goods going back and forth. So you want to make sure that there's maximum amount of goods moving and in a sustainable fashion. And you also want to make sure that it's being done in a way that ensures that security needs are being met, because the security concerns, from my experience that I saw that Israel has, are legitimate ones. And so it takes a fair amount of time and effort and vigilance. I mean, vigilance in a sense, in a policy sense, it takes a lot of staff time and resources to be facilitating and staying on top of all of those kinds of details. So yes, I think that there's space to do that. I think there's the responsibility to do that. The accompanying challenge, though, with it is that for all of the actors involved, generally for them to have the actors on the ground, to see us focusing on those details with them, there also needs to be some political trajectory accompanying it at the same time. So that, first of all, to give them some of the impetus to be doing what is seen, I think, as more of the drudgery work on the facilitation side, and also it allows the folks who are focusing on what you call the drudgery or the details or the boring stuff. It's much easier to do the boring stuff under the radar, out of the spotlight, and let the folks who are doing the political stuff be in the spotlight, and you can usually get a lot more done on what I think is often the more tangible, making a difference in people's lives by working with parties who aren't in the spotlight as much. And they can do a lot more if there's at the same time discussion on politics going on. Ideally, that's also moving somewhere.
Yeah, but actually, I mean, if I may, just one thing that I would take out of this really is the responsibility at a time where we're seeing talk of the U.S. basically disengaging from this issue, the whole reporting of the leadership here lacking interest. It's just the need, even if the big picture collapses for the time being, to remember that there are many things that need to be managed on the ground with a very direct, immediate national security interest for the various players concerned. I think with this note, we should open it up for a conversation. Please wait for the microphone and identify yourself before asking the question.
Just a quick response to that, though. The way that I would see it, though, and what you just said, is I think you have to do two things at once. You have to be able to have a vision to see to the horizon at the same time that you're focusing on the ground in front of you. And you have to be juggling those things at the same time, because you can't just do the ground in front of you and not be able to see the horizon and spell out for people some sort of pathway as you're doing that.
All right, so maybe we'll start there.
Okay, my name is Tom New, and I've worked in the West Bank and Gaza quite a few times. A question for Bob Turner and anyone else who wants to respond on this. I was pleased to see your emphasis on opening the border trade in Rafah, above ground, of course. And I was wondering if in the last few weeks of talk about the unity government, has there been any discussion, either public or chit-chat, about EPA and UBAM reopening that border for normal commercial traffic?
We can do one at a time?
Yeah, let's do one at a time.
Okay. I mean, the short answer is no, in the sense of there's no expectation, and even the AMA doesn't actually call for Egyptians to allow commercial traffic. It holds open the possibility at some point there may be commercial traffic through. I mean, UBAM is supposed to be focusing on people in Kerem Shalom. So there's no expectation there'll be commercial traffic, although they continue to allow Qatari-funded construction material to come through above ground, which has been going on for almost a year now, and that continues to operate. But no expectation there'll be commercial traffic through Rafah.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. My name is Anat Saragusti. I'm the director of B'Tselem USA, but I was also a journalist covering Gaza for several years, and I've been living there occasionally. So I know the situation in Gaza very well. I'm asking about, I mean, how aware and active are you in the the attempt of Israel to separate Gaza completely from the West Bank and treat Gaza as a completely different, entity politically and socially and, in any other term. And so how much are you invested in keeping the ties between the West Bank and Gaza? And we in B'Tselem issued a report about the family separation between Gaza and the West Bank, the fact that Israel doesn't allow any family visits or any family ties to be between Gaza and the West Bank, unless it's a very, first, how do you say that, first degree. People, and now there's also the issue of children visiting their fathers who's been detained in Israeli prisons. But I'm asking about the linkage or the ties or even, you know, commercial commodities coming from the West Bank into Gaza. I know that doesn't exist, but then Israel is the only one that benefits from the commodities that are going into Gaza. So how much are you aware of that, and how much can you invest in that? Thank you.
We're not engaged in those kinds of discussions directly, primarily. We're not a political organization, so certainly UNSCO, the UN Special Coordinator's Office, that's something that they deal more with. The Office of Human Rights deals more with that. And then you have a whole series of particularly Israeli organizations like Isha that are working on those kinds of issues. Goods can come to Gaza from the West Bank, and we do procure goods from the West Bank to Gaza. And so the economic ties exist, but they're one way. I mean, the problem is we can't sell anything from Gaza to the West Bank. And you know, I think all of Israel's legitimate security concerns related to transfer of goods outside of Gaza have been met. I think now and I met with senior leadership of COGAT on this issue just a number of weeks ago. You know, in January of this year, the Dutch Prime Minister came on took a visit to Israel, and one of the things that was supposed to be on his agenda was the inauguration of a container scanner at Kerem Shalom, which the Dutch government had funded, with the agreement beforehand, both the political and technical agreement beforehand, that it would be used to bring stuff in and that it would be used to allow stuff to come out. And before the Prime Minister came, the Israeli government announced that they were not going to allow that to happen. When I brought up the subject of why they would not allow goods to be transferred from the West Bank, or Gaza to the West Bank, given the fact that all their technical concerns have been met, I was told it's because the messages could be passed from Gaza to the West Bank if goods were allowed to transfer. So I asked the obvious question if they heard the internet. She said they had, which was good. I didn't, but should have asked if they heard carrier pigeons. I think the separation policy is policy. I think it's very, very clear. I do think there are legitimate security concerns for transfer of goods from Gaza to the West Bank have been met. And now it's just down to policy. That's simply the policy. They do not want Gaza and the West Bank to have any contact, economic, political, social. It will be interesting to see if the technocratic government is named, which is the easy part, and if they move on to some of the difficult parts over the course of the coming months, years, if there's a change in them. But for the moment, there's no expectation there would be.
My experience is a little more complicated and a lot more nuanced than that. That there are a variety of views inside the government of Israel, and that even within, certainly within Prime Minister Netanyahu's cabinet, during the time that I was serving, even and on the exact issue that you mentioned, that there could be any number of different viewpoints raised, sometimes by the same individual at a given time, but certainly by a number of different people within his cabinet on the issue that you raised. So no, I didn't hear the government speaking with one voice at all on that issue, and in that way. And that's not to say there weren't any number of problems and challenges. And certainly, we spent a great deal of time in pushing for goods to go from Gaza to the West Bank. And there were a couple of, again, one-off pilots or tests of goods going from Gaza to the West Bank, nothing like what the regularity pilots that literally went off. And I'm away from it for a year now, so I can't tell you, what has continued or not over the past year. And I suspect nothing like what we would like, but I also don't know that it's been zero. And in terms of goods going from the West Bank to Gaza, there's a fantastic dairy company in Hebron, Al-Janudi, that has like 2 to 4 shipments of milk a day going into Gaza, just by way of example. That's the highest volume kind of daily stuff, but there's a number of other West Bank companies going into Gaza. So there's more happening there than I think you might expect, but certainly nothing near what needs to happen.
By the way, just to kind of throw in another layer of complexity is that the Egyptians are also affected by this policy of separation. I mean, one of the biggest Egyptian concerns you always heard of is Gaza stopping being an Israeli responsibility and becoming gradually an Egyptian responsibility. And this, I think, in addition to security concerns, informs how Egypt approaches the whole issue of Gaza, how do you, and providing access to Gaza and from Gaza.
Thank you. Neri Silver, Washington Institute for Near East Policy. One question for Robert, and one question for Mara. Robert, there was an UNRWA strike earlier this year that lasted, I think, about 2.5 months. Could you speak to that and tell us a little bit about what brought it about and how it actually was I guess, came to an end? Because we heard that it went on and started, but we didn't quite know what the conditions were for why it ended. And the question for Mara, as a former U.S. government official, there's a debate going on now about funding to the PA. Could you tell us what you might, what advice you would give to congressional leaders, to U.S. officials about U.S. funding to the PA, whether it should continue, and if it should continue, are there conditions where it might conceivably be stopped, given the unity deal? Sure. Thanks.
The strike was in the West Bank office, not in the Gaza operation. We had 1 day of strike, and we then came to an arrangement. We signed a framework agreement on negotiation with our union in Gaza in January, so it was resolved very quickly. In the West Bank, it was primarily about working conditions, technical issues related to currency fluctuations and basic salaries, and issues related to our pay policy. In all 5 fields of operation, our salaries for our staff are set in comparison to the host government. And there's the staff would like those policies changed, so it was primarily around working conditions, almost exclusively around working conditions.
So on the question of funding, and first I should be clear, I'm assuming that you're asking about our funding, about U.S. funding overall to the Palestinians, which is a broad category of which subsection of that goes directly to the Palestinian Authority. So the figures I was using before, roughly $370 to $400 million a year. Of that, that's USAID money, and again, my figures are a year off, but I would guess between 150 and 200 million of that. 200 million of that goes directly to the Palestinian Authority, and so all of the money, you can be sure, given how Congress works and what the U.S. government's own restrictions are, has a tremendous amount of transparency and accountability requirements. And so all of the money that goes to the Palestinian Authority is quite rigorously accounted for, every penny of it. And the bulk, all of it goes to pay debts the Palestinian Authority owes to others, and what the nature is of this government that's being established and in which ways, because the position always has been for the United States government that the issue is not a unity government per se, it's what the nature of that government is, and whether or not there's respect for the Quartet principles, the commitment to nonviolence, the respect of all prior obligations and agreements, and the recognition of the State of Israel. And so those are the 3 things that are looked to. And President Abbas has reiterated more than once his commitment to those things and the idea that a government that he would form would be committed to those things. So my understanding is that the U.S. government's in a wait-and-see posture, and a lot of how they would approach assistance would be as well. And my sense from talking to several folks on the Hill who work very closely on assistance issues is that they're looking at it the same way. The reason I think that makes sense is, again, looking at it purely, not altruistically, but from a U.S. interest perspective, we get a lot for that assistance. The combination of economic assistance, the stuff we do in water, frankly, water and power related issues, as well as the rule of law systems. again, with the perspective of time, if you look 4 years ago, 5 years ago, at what the state of things was in the West Bank and Gaza, understanding the big challenges that Bob has outlined, and what it is now, absent the assistance the United States has put in, the relative level of infrastructure, the goods on the ground, a number of different things, we, the United States, have benefited tremendously in terms of stability and other ways from that assistance. And if we stop providing that assistance, we, as well as Palestinians and Israelis, would feel the harm from that. And so I think we have to think very carefully before we put brakes on that.
Rudman Scaff with the Order of St. John, the St. John of Jerusalem Eye Hospital. Bob, this is your chance to talk about construction a little bit, if you would. We're going to go from the macroscopic to the microscopic. St. John is trying very hard to build a new eye clinic and surgery clinic in Gaza, and I just wonder what the status of that building project is.
I can't tell you specifically with that one, but I wouldn't hold out a lot of hope that it will be done anytime soon. To reiterate what Laura said, the situation is much better now than it was from 2007 to 2010, when no construction material at all was allowed to come in, and then after the Al-Omari disaster, there was a significant easing of the blockade. They went from a positive list. They went from a positive list of what was allowed to a negative list of what was not allowed. So a lot more material. This was the whole rice pasta issue that Senator Kerry at that point had raised. Things were eased, and the construction material for international organizations was allowed to come in under very strict conditions. So if we want to build a clinic, we have to send to QUORUM, to the Israelis, the coordinating body, the location of the project, the donor of the project, the designs of the project, the exact bill of quantities and how much material is going to be required for the project. That process is supposed to take 2 months for them to review that and give us a response. On average now, it's been 18 months for us to get a response. The media reports of last week were actually inaccurate. There was only one new project approved. What happened was we had a large number of approved ongoing projects last year, all of which were suspended in October when they discovered the tunnel between Gaza and Israel. Since then, some of those projects have been allowed to resume, some in December, some in January, etc. All of them have not yet been allowed to resume. And last week we had approval for a new project, which was the first time since March of 2013 that we had a new project approved. So once the project's approved, things move along pretty well. We coordinate on a daily basis how much material is coming in for which projects. We do not buy the material. Our contractors purchase the material from Israeli sources. It comes to Kerem Shalom, to the border crossing. We we monitor that from the time it comes into Gaza until the time it physically goes into one of our projects. So we have a whole team of people that they convoy the material from Kerem Shalom, they follow it to the warehouse or to the construction site. We have 24-hour guards on the material to make sure none of it is diverted. We have now an international staff member whose sole job is to visit the 11 concrete factories to make sure that none of our cement is being diverted for other purposes. The conditions that we meet to satisfy Israeli security concerns cost us $6.7 million last year, which is a conservative figure. That's one we're happy to have audited. It's a very expensive, time-consuming process, and we never know when we're going to be able to build something. So we currently have with QUORUM 37 projects with a value of $95 million. And as I say, only one project's been approved in the last 15 months. We're hoping that more will be approved in advance of a meeting in June. But for non-international organizations, there's no expectation that construction material will be allowed in anytime soon. And so if you wanted your clinic built, you probably you have to ask UNDP, for example, if they would be able to do the monitoring for your construction, which would cost you. But there's really no other way to get material in. So you used to be able to buy it off the local market. It came from Egypt, but that's no longer possible. And the diversion of, and to be fair, the diversion of construction material is a very real concern. It's a legitimate concern that the Israelis have. So I understand why the monitoring regime is in place. I don't understand why it would take 18 months to approve a school project. But that's a secondary issue.
Anathika?
Can you elaborate on these 37 projects that are pending?
Facilities for ourselves, big larger distribution centers, and a couple of our health clinics tear down, to build larger clinics, again, to take care of demographic growth in built-up areas and refugee camps primarily. But it's mostly schools and then clinics and infrastructure.
Do they have to approve also the curricula of the schools?
Well, the curricula is the same one the Israelis use in the schools that they manage in East Jerusalem.
I mean, I'm just wondering, when it comes to these issues in particular, I mean, this goes to my experience, and I know your experience, Mara, is often with these issues, if there's high-level engagement from whether the US or other UN agencies, things can move a bit faster. I mean, this is one of the questions I wonder, as we move to the next phase of the relation with Palestinians and Israelis after the pause in the negotiations. Do you identify these as areas where higher level engagement could facilitate, or is that not something that you see as sustainable? I mean, how do you see the role of the high political echelons in the coming period?
Well, I think as Mara said, you can't do one in isolation of the other. So we have day-to-day technical discussions with COGAT and with CLA, the Border Crossing Management. And then there's a lot of senior engagement. Robert Seri remains very engaged on this, the American Consulate, the American Embassy, the EU. I mean, after the suspension of the projects in October, to get them restarted at all, the Secretary General himself called the Israeli Minister of Defense to pressure to restart the project. So there's no shortage of senior level, sustained senior level engagement, political engagement, as well as ongoing technical discussion.
Right. I mean, I guess to conclude, I'll leave you with one last question, which is, I mean, if you were to choose now one policy issue that should be focused on and changed when it comes to Gaza, within, of course, what's reasonably doable, what would either of you recommend? What should be one thing that we can push on from here and from the ground to get things qualitatively different there?
Access to markets.
I would actually use water. And the reason I would use water is because you could also tap into, no pun intended, the one multilat from Oslo that actually, again, partly because it's continued to exist quietly, has had an impact and has something called MEDRIC, which is the Middle East Desalinization Research Center based out of Oman, that Israel also participates in, that does training in desalinization, does a variety of different work. The Qataris have participated in it. There's a variety of research activities going on. It has had not just MEDRIC, but there's been private and public sector engagement. There's the opportunity to bring a lot of different types of people together. It would work better if it's out of the spotlight, not in the spotlight. But I think it would be a way of stitching together, both for working on starting to resolve an issue that obviously needs to be tackled for Gaza, but might also have a number of other ancillary benefits at the same time.
All right, well, thank you very much, everyone, for attending, and thank you very much, Bob and Mara, for really a wealth of information and things to think about. So please join me in that.